Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney. Sigurd the Mighty was a Viking earl who ruled Orkney around 892, a man whose entire reputation was built on battlefield dominance and ruthless conquest across the northern Isles of Scotland. He was exactly the kind of warrior who expected to die with a sword in his hand, surrounded by enemies he had failed to finish off. Instead, he was killed by a man he had already defeated, decapitated, and strapped to the side of a horse. His rival, Mael Brigte the Buck-toothed, a chieftain whose nickname was apparently not an exaggeration, had been bested by Sigurd in single combat. To celebrate his victory and send a message to anyone watching, Sigurd did what any self-respecting Norse earl would do. He cut off Mael Brigte's head and tied it to his horse's saddle as a trophy for the ride home. As the horse moved, the head bounced rhythmically against the animal's flank, and at some point during that journey, Mael Brigte's famously protruding buck-tooth scraped against Sigurd's leg through his clothing. It was the kind of tiny scratch you would not even notice at the time. Sigurd presumably did not, but in the days that followed, the wound became infected, the infection turned to severe sepsis, and the great Viking Earl of Orkney died from a scratch delivered by the corpse of a man he had already killed. The whole story is recorded in the Orkney saga, a Norse chronicle that historians treat as broadly reliable, and it has the unmistakable ring of something too bizarre to have been invented. There is a grim irony in the fact that Sigurd's downfall was not a superior enemy, a superior army, or even bad luck on a battlefield. It was his own decision to take a trophy home. The Orkney saga does not editorialize about this. It simply records what happened, which is somehow worse. A man who survived raids, battles, and the brutal politics of Norse leadership was undone by a souvenir. Edmund Ironside of England. Edmund Ironside earned his nickname through sheer physical and military tenacity, spending the better part of 1016 fighting an exhausting campaign against the Danish king Canute across the length of England. He was the kind of king who led from the front and seemed almost impossible to stop on a battlefield. His reign lasted only 7 months, and according to the medieval chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing roughly 100 years after the events, it did not end on any battlefield at all. It ended in a latrine. Henry of Huntingdon recorded that an assassin, whose identity was never confirmed though suspicion fell heavily on supporters of Canute, had concealed himself in the pit beneath a wooden toilet seat and waited. When Edmund sat down to relieve himself, the assassin struck upward twice, fatally wounding the king from the most undignified angle imaginable. Some historians have raised doubts about this account and suggested Edmund may have died from wounds sustained in battle, which would at least be a more fitting end for a man called Ironside. But the latrine story has survived in the historical record for over 1,000 years, and Henry of Huntingdon was not known for inventing things without some basis in the stories circulating around him. Either way, Edmund had fought Viking invaders to a standstill, held the throne against enormous pressure, split England with Canute in a peace agreement that reflected genuine military stalemate, and his reign ended in a moment of complete and total vulnerability. He had earned a warrior's reputation in every possible respect, and history chose to remember him in a latrine. Bela I of Hungary. Bela I came to the Hungarian throne in 1060 after a bitter and violent civil war against his own nephew, King Solomon, who had been backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. Seizing a crown through family conflict is already a messy way to start a reign, and Bela's time on the throne lasted only 3 years before the universe apparently decided to deliver its verdict on the whole enterprise. While sitting in formal royal state, surrounded by his court in the full ceremonial weight of kingship, the heavy wooden canopy structure above his throne simply gave way. The carved frame, the supporting beams, the entire overhead structure collapsed directly downward onto the seated king. Courtiers watched in frozen horror as the thing they had all been standing beneath without a second thought crushed the man it was designed to make look powerful. Bela survived the initial collapse, which in some ways made it worse, because it meant there were several agonizing hours or days during which everyone involved had to sit with what had just happened before he died from his injuries. He had fought a civil war, deposed a king, and secured one of the most contested thrones in Central Europe, only to be killed by his own furniture. The throne, as a physical object, is supposed to be the symbol of royal permanence and authority. In Bela's case, it was the thing that finished him. James II of Scotland. James II of Scotland had what can only be described as an obsession with artillery. In the mid-15th century, Gunpowder technology was genuinely cutting edge, and James threw himself into it with an enthusiasm that his advisors probably found alarming. In 1460, he was besieging Roxburgh Castle, determined to reclaim it from English control, and he had brought along some of the finest cannons available, including one he was particularly proud of, a heavy gun nicknamed the Lion. James positioned himself close to the Lion to watch it fire, which was either a gesture of confidence in his equipment or a catastrophic failure to understand the danger of standing next to poorly constructed artillery. The cannon exploded on firing, rather than sending its shot toward the castle. A large iron fragment from the disintegrating barrel struck James and killed him instantly, in front of his assembled army, during a siege he had personally organized. The darkly impressive footnote to this story is that his wife, Mary of Guelders, took command of the situation, rallied the forces, and continued the siege until Roxburgh Castle fell. The king died for it and never saw it happen, but the castle was taken. James had spent years building up Scotland's artillery capabilities as a strategic priority, viewing cannons as the future of warfare and a way to offset English advantages. He was not wrong about that. He was simply wrong about where to stand. Charles VIII of France. Charles VIII was 27 years old when he died in 1498, which is young by any measure, but the circumstances make it feel even more wasteful, because his death was caused by a doorframe. He was at the Château d'Amboise and walking quickly through its corridors to watch a game of real tennis, the early indoor court sport popular among European nobility and quite different from the lawn version the word brings to mind today. Moving through a low and poorly lit stone passage, he failed to duck in time and struck his forehead hard against a wooden lintel above the doorway. The accounts describe him shaking it off, making some remark about the incident, and continuing on to watch the match as planned. He then spent several hours standing, watching, and presumably thinking very little about the knock to his head, before collapsing mid-conversation into a coma from which he never recovered. The brain hemorrhage killed him the same day. Charles left no surviving heirs. The direct Valois line ended with him, and the French crown passed to his cousin. An entire succession crisis, a reshaping of French dynastic politics, all set in motion because he was walking too fast through a dark hallway and misjudged the height of a door. Martin of Aragon. Martin of Aragon was already in serious physical decline by 1410, described by contemporaries in terms that suggest his health and his appetite had been in a long and mutually destructive relationship for some time. He was the last ruler of the House of Barcelona, and he spent his final night on earth in a manner perfectly consistent with everything history recorded about him. His dinner that evening included an entire roasted goose consumed in one sitting, after which he retired to bed in considerable distress with severe indigestion, which anyone paying attention could have predicted. His court jester, a man named Bora, was brought in to lift the king's spirits. When Martin asked Bora where he had been, Bora replied that he had just seen a young deer hanging by its tail from a tree in a vineyard. The joke, such as it was, apparently struck Martin as the funniest thing he had ever heard. He laughed uncontrollably, the kind of helpless, whole-body laughter that under normal circumstances is a delight, and under the circumstances of severe digestive crisis and serious underlying illness is a medical emergency. The combination of extreme physical exertion from laughing, the stress on a body already in distress from the goose, and whatever illness had already been weakening him proved fatal. He collapsed and died, still laughing. Because Martin left no legitimate heir, his death triggered a succession crisis that reshaped the political landscape of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Crown Prince Sado of Korea. Crown Prince Sado of the Joseon dynasty had exhibited years of violent and erratic behavior that modern historians, reviewing the detailed records left behind, have suggested may reflect severe mental illness. The royal court operated under strict laws that prohibited directly executing a crown prince or shedding royal blood. His father, King Yeongjo, had endured years of shame and escalating crisis before arriving at a solution that technically satisfied the letter of the law while functioning as a death sentence. In 1762, in the height of a Korean summer, Yeongjo ordered his son to climb inside a large wooden rice storage chest, sealed airtight, measuring roughly 4 feet by 4 feet. Sado was locked inside, and the chest was left in the open palace courtyard. He died over the course of 8 days from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and suffocation, a slow and terrible end carried out in full view of the palace, in silence, within the rules. The event is documented in extraordinary and heartbreaking detail in the memoir written by Sato's own wife, Lady Haegyong, known as the Memoirs of Lady Haegyong, one of the most remarkable personal accounts to survive from the Joseon period. She witnessed it. She wrote it down. The document exists. Adolf Fredrik of Sweden. Adolf Fredrik of Sweden reigned for 20 years and is remembered today almost entirely for one evening in 1771 when he sat down to dinner and did not stop. His final meal opened with lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, and champagne, which would already represent a significant commitment for most people. He then moved on to dessert, specifically hetfag, a traditional Swedish pastry consisting of wheat buns filled with almond paste, served warm in bowls of hot milk. He ate 14 of them, not 14 bites, 14 individual servings. His digestive system, faced with what amounted to an act of warfare, surrendered. He went into fatal digestive collapse shortly after the meal and died at 61 years old. Swedish schoolchildren still encounter his name today, primarily through the phrase, "the king who ate himself to death," which is a legacy of a very specific kind. He had reigned for 2 decades, navigated the complex constitutional politics of Sweden's Age of Liberty, presided over a country in genuine political transformation, and his lasting contribution to national memory is as a cautionary tale about dessert portions. Historians note that the Age of Liberty during his reign was defined by Parliament holding most real power, meaning Adolf Fredrik spent much of his kingship as a largely ceremonial figure. He had very little to do, which may, in some indirect way, explain the 14 pastries. George II of Great Britain. George II was 77 years old in 1760, and was by that point largely a ceremonial figure, real political power having shifted toward Parliament and his ministers over the course of a long reign. On an entirely ordinary October morning, he followed a routine he had presumably followed hundreds of times before. He woke up, drank his customary cup of hot chocolate, and retired to his private closet to use the close stool, which was the standard 18th-century arrangement for royal toilet facilities. His valet waited outside. What the valet heard was a tremendous crash. George had strained so forcefully during his bowel movement that he ruptured an aortic aneurysm, a catastrophic tearing of the wall of the main artery carrying blood from his heart. The sudden spike in internal pressure from the physical effort was enough to finish what the aneurysm had apparently been waiting to do. He fell from the close stool and was found collapsed on the floor, dead before any assistance could be rendered. The historical contrast is worth noting. George II was the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle, which he did at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, sword drawn, at the head of his men. He was genuinely brave in a way that many of his contemporaries acknowledged, even when they disliked him politically. He died in a closet, alone, 17 years later, which is the kind of ending that no biography can fully prepare you for. Frederick Lewis, Prince of Wales. Frederick Lewis, Prince of Wales, was the heir to the British throne, the son of George II, and the father of the future King George III, which means he occupies the peculiar historical position of being a man who was enormously important to the royal succession without ever actually becoming king. He was well liked by the public in ways his cold and famously dismissive father was not, and he was a genuine enthusiast for cricket at a time when the sport was rapidly growing in popularity among English nobility. During a match, he was struck in the chest by a fast-moving ball. The impact did not knock him down or alarm anyone present, including apparently Frederick himself, but it created a deep internal abscess that went undiagnosed and untreated over the following months. While recovering in bed from what appeared to be an unrelated illness, the abscess burst suddenly and without warning, causing immediate respiratory failure. He died in 1751 at 44 years old, never having worn the crown, leaving his son George to eventually inherit what Frederick had spent his life preparing for. The cricket ball is the traditional account, and historians broadly accept it, though the exact medical sequence across those intervening months is difficult to verify with complete precision. His father George II, who had never disguised his contempt for his son, reportedly showed little grief at the news, which given their famously bitter relationship surprised no one at court. Alexander of Greece. King Alexander of Greece was 27 years old in 1920, when he took a walk through the royal gardens in Athens with his German shepherd. His dog got into a fight with a domestic Barbary macaque monkey kept on the palace grounds. Alexander did what most people would instinctively do and stepped in to break it up. A second monkey attacked him from behind, biting him on the leg and torso several times before being driven off. The bites were cleaned and bandaged, and the whole incident probably seemed like an unpleasant afternoon rather than a crisis. Within days, the wounds were heavily infected with sepsis. Royal physicians, reportedly reluctant to amputate the leg of a sitting monarch without absolute certainty it was necessary, delayed the decision until the infection had advanced beyond the point where amputation could stop it. Alexander died 3 weeks after the monkey attack. The political consequences were staggering. His unexpected death triggered a succession crisis that destabilized Greece at a critical moment, contributing to the conditions that led to the catastrophic Greco-Turkish War. Winston Churchill later wrote, in a remark that has been cited ever since, that it was perhaps no exaggeration to say that 250,000 people died of this monkey bite. Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known throughout Europe by her nickname Sisi, was one of the most famous royals of the 19th century, and spent much of her later life traveling incognito, moving between cities under assumed names to escape the public attention she found suffocating. On September 10, 1898, she was walking along the shore of Lake Geneva toward a steamship when a young Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini approached and bumped into her. Lucchini had been carrying a needle file, an extremely thin sharpened tool, and had driven it directly into her chest as he passed. The weapon was so narrow and the wound so small that it barely bled externally. Sisi's corset, laced with the extraordinary tightness fashionable for women of her era and status, compressed the wound and held internal pressure against it, effectively sealing off the external bleeding. She fell briefly, was helped up by bystanders, thanked them, smoothed her dress, and walked up the gangplank onto the ship under her own power. She told her attendants she felt a little faint. Only after the ship had left the dock and her attendants began unlacing her corset did the pressure release and the internal bleeding accelerate. She lost consciousness almost immediately and died before the ship could return to shore, never having understood that she had been stabbed through the heart. She was 60 years old. Lucchini was arrested within minutes on the Geneva waterfront, having just successfully assassinated one of the most recognizable women in Europe with a sewing tool. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.